Story number 1. The Spectral Lights. It was 1972 when I first came to Alaska, drawn by the wild, untamed beauty of its vast landscapes and the promise of solitude. The idea of venturing deep into the Alaskan wilderness to hunt and experience the untouched, primordial land was a dream I had nurtured for years. I wasn't alone. Several of my hunting friends from the lower 48 had come with me, and together, we set up camp near a secluded lake in the dense forest. None of us could have known that what awaited us there would change everything. The trip started off like any other. We were all experienced hunters, accustomed to the raw conditions of the wilderness. We set up camp at the edge of a small clearing, perfect spot for hunting. The weather was chilly but manageable, and the thick trees surrounding us made it feel like we had the world to ourselves. For the first few days, we focused on setting up our camp, gathering firewood, and hunting moose in the surrounding forests. But there was something in the air, something about the quiet that felt off. The wind didn't whistle through the trees as it should have. The silence pressed down on us like a heavy weight. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to go wrong. We had been hunting that day, and I was exhausted when I crawled into my tent. It was a clear night, and I could see the stars through the open flap. The kind of stars that seem so close. You feel like you could reach out and touch them. The fire was crackling low, and the other guys were still sitting around, chatting quietly. I lay there in the dark, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees, trying to drift off. Then I saw it, a flicker in the sky, like a distant, blue star, but brighter, much brighter. I thought at first it was a plane or a satellite, but it wasn't moving in any direction I could recognize. It was too steady, too still. My curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed out of my sleeping bag and stepped outside to get a better look. The light wasn't alone. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The blue light hovered just above the treeline, pulsating, almost like a lantern swinging in the wind. But as I stared at it, I noticed something else. Shadowy shapes moving along the edges of the trees, moving too fluidly to be animals. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, slinking and shifting like dark, liquid creatures. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the result of too many days spent hunting and too little sleep. But then I heard it, the whispering. First, it was soft, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, like 100 voices, murmuring just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, frantic, and somehow wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned to look back at the camp. The whispers were closer now, almost behind me. I turned my head sharply, my eyes scanning the trees. There, just beyond the campfire's reach, I saw movement, a large, dark figure. It was tall, too tall, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity, like it was gliding across the ground. The shadows around it seemed to warp and shift, as though the very darkness was alive and twisting around it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, staring at the figure. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a coldness crawling up my spine, an unnatural chill that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Then, without thinking, I turned and ran. I ran without looking back, crashing through the underbrush, my legs burning, my breath ragged. The light above the trees flickered in my peripheral vision, but I didn't dare stop to look. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, becoming louder, sharper. I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my mind, but they felt like they were coming from all around me, pressing in on me like an invisible weight. I ran straight through the night, desperate to get away from whatever had followed me into the woods. When I finally collapsed at the edge of the clearing, gasping for air, I dared to look back. There was nothing there. I don't know how long I stayed in the woods that night, hiding in the dark, terrified to make a sound. The light had disappeared, and the whispers had faded into the wind. But even as I huddled there in the freezing cold, I knew something wasn't right. Something had been in those woods, something that had followed me, something that had waited for me to see it. The next morning, I made my way back to camp, but the others were already packing up. Mike and Eric had seen it too, the light, the shadows, the strange whispers in the night. They had heard the same thing I had, and they didn't hesitate to leave when the first light of dawn broke over the forest. We didn't talk much as we packed up, none of us wanting to speak the words that lingered in the air. We left that morning, driving in tense silence, the weight of what we had seen hanging over us. I never spoke to any of them about it again. To this day, I've never set foot in Alaska again. I've read reports of strange lights and unexplained phenomena in the wilderness, and I've heard stories of others who have witnessed the same thing. Strange lights in the sky, whispers in the trees, and figures that move too smoothly to be human. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Whatever was out there, whatever followed me in the woods, wasn't from this world. It was something old, something that had been waiting for a long time. So if you ever find yourself in the Alaskan wilderness, and you see lights flickering on the horizon, or hear whispers on the wind, don't follow them, don't turn around, because whatever's out there is waiting. Story number 2. The Whispering Shadows of the Alaska Triangle. I should have stayed home. It was a thought that had echoed in my mind countless times since that day, a quiet warning buried beneath my bravado. But when you're a writer chasing a story, especially one as tantalizing as the Alaska Triangle, staying home isn't an option. I first heard about the triangle through an article buried deep in the archives of a small travel magazine. Over 16,000 people had disappeared in the area in the last 50 years. Pilots, hunters, hikers, tourists all vanished without a trace. The stories ranged from mundane theories about harsh weather to downright bizarre legends. But the one that stuck with me was the Kushtaka. The Kushtaka, according to the native Tlingit people, were shape-shifting spirits, half man, half otter, tricksters, they said, demons that mimicked voices, lured you into the woods, and made sure you never came back. Sounded absurd, until I found myself in Anchorage, staring out over the vast, untouched wilderness, with nothing but a notebook, a backpack, and a gnawing sense of foreboding. I hired a local guide named Alan, a wiry man in his 50s with skin weathered by years of harsh winters. He didn't say much when I told him what I was looking for, just lit a cigarette, blew a thin stream of smoke into the cold air, and said, "The woods out here don't care if you believe in them or not. They'll swallow you whole either way." His words stuck with me as we traveled deeper into the triangle. The landscape was breathtaking, towering pines, jagged mountains, rivers slicing through the earth like silver veins. But there was something else, too, a silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses down on your chest and makes you glance over your shoulder. The first night, we camped near the edge of a dense forest. Alan built the fire while I set up my tent, the crackling flames a small comfort against the vast darkness beyond. We didn't talk much. He wasn't the type for idle chatter, and I was too busy scribbling notes, already piecing together the opening lines of my article. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I heard it, a sound faint and distant, but unmistakable. A voice. "Help me." I froze, the pen slipping from my fingers. The voice was high-pitched, almost childlike, and it came from the trees. Alan looked up, his face darkening. "Stay by the fire," he said, standing and grabbing his rifle. "But, I mean it." His tone brooked no argument. He moved toward the treeline, disappearing into the shadows. I sat by the fire, every muscle in my body tense. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please help." I stood, unable to stop myself. The voice sounded so desperate, so real. I took a step toward the trees, then another. The darkness seemed to pull at me, the voice growing louder, more insistent, and then Alan's hand clamped down on my shoulder, yanking me back. Don't, he hissed. His eyes were wild, his face pale. It's not real. The next day, Alan was quieter than usual. He didn't mention the voice, and neither did I, but something had shifted. The woods felt different, heavier, as if they were watching us. Around midday, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a wooden structure, a crude hut made of branches and animal hides. It was ancient, the wood dark with age, the hides brittle and cracked. The air around it was cold, colder than it should have been. Alan refused to go near it. "That's not ours," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't belong here." I ignored him, my curiosity winning out. The inside of the hut was empty, save for a strange symbol carved into the dirt floor. A circle with jagged lines radiating outward. I traced the lines with my finger, the grooves strangely warm despite the chill. That night, the dreams started. I was running through the woods, the trees towering above me like prison bars. Something was chasing me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its breath on my neck, its claws scraping against the ground. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The fire had gone out, and Alan's tent was empty. "Alan," I called, stepping outside. The moon cast an eerie glow over the campsite, the shadows long and twisting. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to me. "Alan," I said, relief flooding through me, but he didn't respond. I walked closer, the hair on my arms standing on end. "Are you okay?" He turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't Alan. The thing wearing his face smiled, its eyes black as pitch, its teeth too sharp. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in a voice that wasn't his. I don't remember much after that. I ran, blindly crashing through the woods, the thing's laughter echoing behind me. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed in Anchorage. They said a search party had found me 3 days later, wandering along the highway, barefoot and delirious. Alan was never found. They told me it was hypothermia, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. I left Alaska the next day, but the dreams have followed me. Every night, I'm back in those woods, running, the thing's laughter ringing in my ears. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear it, "Help me," and I know it's waiting for me to come back. Story number 3. The Hollow Silence of Enjikuni. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. As a journalist, I've always looked at the world through a lens of reason and evidence. But what happened in Enjikuni changed everything. I first heard about the story from a colleague, a small Inuit village deep in the Canadian wilderness, where every single resident mysteriously vanished in 1930. No bodies, no footprints, nothing, just empty tents, half-eaten meals, and graves that had been dug up, the bones inside taken. It sounded like a campfire tale, one too strange to ignore. "You're not scared, are you?" James, my friend, asked when I told him about the trip. I just laughed, slapping him on the back. "I'm chasing the truth, not ghosts," I said, but I didn't realize what I was walking into. It took 2 days of snowmobile travel through frozen wastelands to reach the abandoned village. The landscape was an endless sea of white, and the silence was oppressive. When I arrived, it felt like stepping into a photograph frozen in time. The tents were still standing, their fabric weathered and torn but eerily intact. Inside one, I found a pot on the stove, its contents frozen solid. A ladle leaned against the rim, and plates with half-eaten meals sat on tables as if their owners had simply stood up and left mid-bite. But the strangest part was the graves. There were dozens of them, shallow pits dug into the permafrost, but they were all empty. No bones, no remains, just gaping holes in the earth. I knelt beside one and brushed away the snow, shining my flashlight into the void. The dirt had been clawed apart, as though whatever had taken the bones wasn't human. That night, I pitched my tent on the outskirts of the village. I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside one of the abandoned homes. They felt too still, too wrong. As darkness fell, the silence became suffocating. There was no wind, no animal calls, just the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for any sound. And then I heard it, a whisper. First, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks of the tents. But it wasn't random. It had rhythm, like a chant sung by many voices, distant and faint. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. The whispers stopped. The only response was the echo of my own voice fading into the night. The next morning, I decided to explore the village further. The whispering hadn't returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I combed through the tents again, looking for clues, but all I found were remnants of everyday life frozen in time. Then, I went back to the graveyard. The air there felt heavier, colder. I counted the graves, 29, all empty. Kneeling by one, I noticed a strange smell. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the earthy scent of decay. It was faintly sweet, like rotting fruit, and it made my stomach churn. I turned my flashlight on and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of snow. That night, couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, the faint creak of footsteps on snow, the rustle of fabric, the murmur of voices just out of earshot. I stepped outside my tent with my flashlight, scanning the darkness. My breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and the beam of light revealed only the empty village. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a face, pale, eyeless face staring at me from the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The next day, I found it. In the largest tent, there was a strange circle drawn on the floor, etched into the frozen dirt. The lines were sharp and precise, and in the center were symbols I couldn't recognize. They made my head ache just looking at them. Around the circle, there were stains, dark, reddish-brown, faded but unmistakable. Blood. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to find some wild animal or perhaps another explorer. Instead, I saw them, dozens of figures, standing motionless in the doorway of the tent. Their faces were pale, their eyes nothing but black voids. Their mouths were open, but they made no sound. My heart stopped as I realized they weren't breathing. One of them stepped forward, and a hand as cold as death touched my shoulder. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was in a hospital in Churchill, Manitoba. A rescue team had found me 10 miles from the village. Half frozen and delirious, they said I'd been wandering aimlessly in the snow, mumbling nonsense. No one believed my story. They said it was hypothermia, that the cold had driven me to hallucinate. But I know what I saw, and every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of them, those eyeless faces staring back at me. I escaped Anjakuni, but I don't think it's done with me.